Get back to that question of if you can do it for Aboriginal people, you can do it for everyone else. You sit in the Wallumbilla Court or the Circle Court and you just think, this is just kind of a no-brainer.
Absolutely.
Like, that's the system we've been doing for 300 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Why have you done this stuff before?
Welcome everybody to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. Today I'm joined by Brendan Thomas. He's the Deputy Secretary of Transforming Aboriginal Outcomes at the Department of Communities and Justice here in New South Wales. He's got a significant responsibility around the reform agenda for DCJ. He's been a part of some significant work in terms of looking at how we address the forced child removal rates across the sector, looking at how we understand the justice system in terms of the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in justice. And overall, it's a really significant conversation because it's one that gives us an opportunity, particularly for our senior leaders and decision makers, to really understand what some of the critical ingredients are for really having a significant impact around policy, around practice, and around change on the ground and in community. So please enjoy. Thanks. Before we kick off, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge country. I want to recognise that many people that are watching and listening to this are doing this across First Nations countries, across Australia here today. I want to take a moment to pay our deepest respects to our elders, both past and present, and recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. This podcast has been recorded here on Gadigal country here in Sydney, and not far from the communities in which many of the people that are from Impact Policy are from as well. So I want to take a moment to again extend our deepest respects to elders from country and community here, and extend that respect to any other mob listening along, wherever you are in the world, and to you too, brother, as well. So joined by Brendan Thomas. He's the Deputy Secretary at Department of Communities and Justice. And I might give you a moment, Brad, to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what that sort of means in your world.
Thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you. Name's Brendan Thomas. I'm a Wiradjuri man, born and bred in Sydney. Family's originally from Central Western New South Wales. I work at the moment at the Department of Communities and Justice. You might know that department's a pretty big thing. It covers all of the criminal justice system, so courts, corrections, youth justice, housing, child protection, policies around domestic violence, all sorts of legal stuff. A really big beast. I've been there for about 18 months, a little bit over 18 months, in a job that's trying to look at how do we change that department to make it better for Aboriginal people.
And like you said, massive piece of work, many different, I guess, pieces of the puzzle sit within DCJ, like you talked about, and many of those sorts of areas that disproportionately sort of probably impact our communities. How hard has it been coming into a space like that over the last sort of 18 months to progress some sort of a change, and what's that journey been like? Yeah,
it's probably been the most challenging job I've ever had, to be honest with you. My background's in the criminal justice system, so I know that system pretty well. I know it from working in it for 30 years. I knew it as a kid with contacts and friends with in and out of that system a fair bit. So I know that side of DCJ very well. The child protection side, I've not worked in that area before, and it's an area that needs a huge amount of work. The big challenge for DCJ and the work that we do is making sure those systems think about people. It's really easy for big things like the justice system, the care and protection system to get caught up in their own importance.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the end of it's people. And for our mob, it's the same people.
Totally.
It's the same families. It's got, mum or dad in prison, kids in out-of-home care, living in public housing. Totally. It's the same families in different parts of the system. And that system, it can either work, I think, to make those people's lives better, or it can work to pull them apart. And too often it pulls them apart.
Absolutely.
And the challenge for us is to fix that and to stop it.
Am I correct in when you came across to your current role in DCJ, is that like a group DepSec role in terms of your focus around transforming Aboriginal outcomes, or how does that sort of look?
It's an odd role. So when my job was created, it was just a job. There was nothing else. So extra budget or extra people was just a job. And I was able to pull some existing people from other parts of DCJ together into a single division. It's still very, very small.
Mm.
But my job is really trying to influence the other parts of the organisation to make some significant changes. So the frustration for me is I don't have immediate control or levers of decision making, and I need to influence other people to make those changes. And in some parts of the system, that's pretty easy. In other parts of the system, that's really tough.
Yeah. Is it the first time that DCJ's had an Aboriginal staff member at that level influencing policy?
In a previous job, I used to be a DepSec in the old Department of Justice. And when I was there, it wasn't an Aboriginal identified job. It was just a general DepSec job. And I was in charge of legislation, policy, strategy, a whole bunch of programs in courts. And so as an Aboriginal person in that job, I really took a strong Aboriginal approach to everything that we did. But it is the first time the department's had a job that's just dedicated to try and look at everything it does from an Aboriginal point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting in a lot of ways. I think about some of the systemic opportunities to do things differently and the impacts that can have positively for our communities. And it's amazing that we now have identified roles driving that sort of change and that sort of policy work. But what's exciting as well is I think that the impact that our ways of thinking and doing and our community ways of working has for transforming policy broadly as well. I think that workshop we were at a month or two ago around out of home care and stuff, one of the aunties in the crowd, she said something that always stood up, and she said it really stayed with me when I walked away. She was like, if you get this right for our kids, you get this right for all kids.
Completely right. Completely right. And if you look at the challenges our communities face, they're the most complicated challenges you got. The most deep-seated problems that have taken generations to get to where they are at the moment. And you've got systems that aren't designed for us or for our people. And to make the transformation that we need to make, it's really about transforming those systems around people. So you're putting people at the centre of what you're doing. And if you do that for our mob, you've automatically done it for everybody else. Like it just flows from that, right?
Absolutely. What are some of the highlights that you've sort of seen, so you've come across, noting that, it's been challenging to move into that sort of space? Has there been some sort of, even if they're not highlights, but I guess, things that you're seeing as potential for impact?
Lots. The Wallama Court is one of the things we stood up last year as a new court. I've been involved in Aboriginal courts for 20 years. I worked on establishing the first circle sentencing court in 2001, 2002, and a long time ago. But those courts are really good examples of the change in needed. If I just talk a little bit about what they are and why they're different.
Please, totally.
So if you take a criminal court in Australia, it's like the most British thing the British left behind. Like it is as British as you can get.
Totally.
It's based around making legal decisions about legal arguments. The people that are involved in those cases don't participate at all.
Absolutely.
If you go into a traditional courtroom, you've got a judge or a magistrate sitting on a bench deliberately above everybody else. Like it's designed that way so that it's intimidating and it shows the authority of the Crown. You've got all of the discussion that happening in a criminal court, at least between a prosecutor who's representing the state, talks about the victim but doesn't really represent that person, and a defence lawyer who represents the person that's accused of the crime. Almost never does the person accused of the crime ever talk on their own.
Absolutely.
Never. They just sit there. If you go in courts with our mob in it, they just kind of sit there and stare at the floor. Everything happens around them. The court finishes and often they don't really know what happened at all.
Totally.
The changes with circle courts and Koori courts and the Wallama court, Aboriginal courts, was to try and say, how do you do some big things? One is, if this thing's going to have any legitimacy in the eyes of the people that are in it, they have to have confidence in it. They need to believe in it. They need to believe in the authority of the court. And for most of our mob, nobody does. It's something that's imposed on you, not something that's there to protect your rights. But secondly, if it's going to work for our mob, those other people need to take a back seat, right? And it needs to be designed from a cultural point of view around cultural ways of communication and engaging families. And so the first of those courts was the Circle Court. And the first one was in Nowra. And I remember at the time talking to the magistrate saying, we want to test a different way of running a court where we want all the lawyers and everybody else to take a back seat. We want the person that's accused of the crime and probably the person who experienced it to actually talk about what happened and why. And we want you to share your authority with local elders so you're making decisions together. Yeah. And to his credit, he said yes. Really didn't know what he was getting himself into. But he said yes. And so what happens then is you come off the bench, so you get rid of that physical hierarchy.
Totally.
Sit on a circle with elders, respected people, war people from that area. You get the person accused of the crime and their family and anybody else they really think needs to come along. The person that's experienced the crime, the victim of the crime, can come if they choose to.
Yep.
And you just talk about, how did you end up here? What happened in your life to end you up in this circumstance, in this court today? And what do we need to do to stop you from doing it again and to help you turn your life around? But also, what do we need to do to right the wrong that's happened?
Absolutely.
And it's incredibly powerful. It takes longer than a regular court. It was really interesting when we first started doing it. Everybody wanted to trial it. And after a little while, the lawyers that were involved were like, well, what's our job? We don't know what our job is. Like we're making statements in the court and then all these black balls talking.
Yeah.
For them, they feel a bit uncomfortable. And the first magistrate that was doing it used to ring me up and say, can you buy me a table? Got all these papers. I need a table to put these papers on. And he kept asking me for it. I kept saying, I can't buy a table. I've got money, I can't buy a table. We didn't have a budget for this thing. A couple of years later, he admitted to me he didn't need a table. He just felt so exposed in this circle that he wanted to hide behind something.
Yeah.
And testament to him, he felt completely uncomfortable every time he went into one of those circles, but he kept doing it.
Kept showing up.
He kept showing up and became the greatest advocate for it.
Yeah, wow.
But what it was I think, a way to take the British legal system and try and Aboriginalise it. Try and bring culture in, try and bring community in, put people and family at the centre. And we did that without changing a single piece of law and initially without spending any money. All it was people agreeing to do things differently, to share authority with community, to think about how you put culture at the centre of what you do, and to give everyone a seat at the table so that you're actually talking about problems and put the problem at the centre, not the law, not legal argument, and start to solve that. And so last year we started doing that in the district court. For people who don't know the court system in New South Wales, we have a local court which deals with most stuff. Yeah. And we have a district court and a Supreme Court. Supreme Court deals with not much, just murder usually. Yeah. The district court deals with really serious crime. And so we're always worried of, can you bring an Aboriginal court to a district court where the crimes are really serious, where people are probably going to go to jail or possibly already in jail? Yeah. And will community want to participate in that? And the example is yes, you can, and yes, they do. And you guys are working on the evaluation of it. Yeah. It's pretty early days, but man, it's looking good.
Absolutely.
It's looking very good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think so much of that stuff you talk to really rings true in terms of the roles of all the different pieces of the puzzle in the courtroom, from, I guess, a traditional, British colonial way of those systems operating and how we see things like Walama in operation as well. And I think we know that for the most part, our prison population is made up of men and women that have experienced complex trauma and a range of different things throughout their lives. And so one of the most, I guess, critical things that we see when we look at Walama is putting the offender in the space in terms of trying to understand why they're there. And for many of the fellows that we've even been yarning to, some of them talk about the first time that they've actually had a voice in a space like that to understand and communicate why they're there. And that the actual opportunity to have a space like that, the power for that in terms of healing and as a therapeutic process around justice. Just as us in early days of observing is so refreshing in terms of the actual potential for reducing reoffending. Yeah. And I think it's a really exciting time. And it's funny when you're talking about the experience with the circle sentencing and the prosecutor not understanding their role and stuff. I was observing the other week, and the first time I went into Wallumer, I couldn't believe that, same sort of thing. I've been working in justice in different capacity over the years, sat in many different courtrooms. It was the first time where I actually saw prosecutors talking directly to, the offenders that are there about offending behaviour, and with a genuine interest about reducing reoffending and the factors around what's bringing them back to court. Like participants having a voice in that process is one of the most pivotal things. It's
You can get back to that question of if you can do it for Aboriginal people, you can do it for everyone else. You sit in a Wallumer court or the Circle Court and you just think, this is just kind of a no-brainer.
Absolutely.
Like, it's a system we've been doing for 300 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Why have you done this stuff before?
100%. And I think you're exactly right. Like, Wallumer is grounded in principles of how our communities have done business and work for so long. But there's absolutely no reason why that way of working and thinking can't be a way we think about it more
everywhere,
broadly.
right? So
absolutely,
the example of those courts, and Wallumer's a great example because it started through the work of a judge called Dina Yehia, who is now Supreme Court Justice. She was a lawyer at the Aboriginal Legal Service in Dubbo for many years, became a district court judge and said, this doesn't work.
Yep.
This isn't giving us the outcomes that we want. And got a group of people around her, predominantly Aboriginal people, to say, how can we design a different court? And they just went ahead and did it.
Yeah.
And I say, if a district court judge can do that, everyone can do that.
Absolutely.
Everyone in a decision-making position can have a look at what they're doing, redesign that from the point of view of the people that are experiencing those decisions, and empower community and share authority in making decisions.
Absolutely.
If you can do it in the district court, you can do it in child protection, you can do it everywhere.
Totally.
You can do it everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, Wallumer sort of, when you were talking about the circle sentencing model, I was thinking a lot about youth justice conferencing.
Yeah.
And, the model that we have around youth justice conferencing is probably not too dissimilar in a lot of ways in terms of how we think about that sort of way of working.
Yeah.
But I think about some of the critical ingredients around what makes stuff like circle sentencing and what we think Wallumer really effective is that real presence of and cultural authority of the elders in that space, and I think having embedded that in those processes has really set it up for success for the long term.
Yeah,
and I think they're probably some of our biggest learnings in terms of where we've tried to do it in other parts of the system, and we've missed those cultural ingredients. The wheels fall off in terms of sustaining the real impact for the community.
The lesson from those courts is you can take, if you're the person with authority, you can take a step back and share that authority with people in a real way.
Yeah.
And it costs you nothing. It might cost you a bit more time. Like, these things usually take longer to do, which is not a bad thing. Slowing decision-making down is always good.
Yeah.
But the outcome is always better.
Yeah.
And you talk to a judge or a magistrate involved in these courts, and they'll always tell you the outcomes are better because the information they get is better. The conversation just leads to insights that you never get.
Yeah.
And you're putting the person at centre and you're solving a problem. You're not just administering the law.
Absolutely.
And it's just a different way of doing things. But it's Aboriginal people that have forced that change in the court system. And it's our culture that has caused people just to think differently and then start to think differently about other things. And as I say, if you can do it in a stuffy court, you can just do it anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, from a cultural perspective, just some of the times we've observed the power dynamics culturally and with with the state, like with the judges that hold the most power legally within the room, and it's just ironic. Not ironic's the wrong word, but it's powerful to see when you sit there and you've got the judge who's saying to the person that's before the court, like, it's really sad to see you back here in Greens. But I'm really happy to see you. I look forward to seeing you because I actually genuinely, you got a beautiful smile and you got so much potential for what you're trying to work on and do. Let's talk a little bit about how we can try and understand how we get back to what happened that brought you here and what we can work towards case plan wise to make sure you don't come back.
Yeah.
And sit there and hear the judge talk like that from such a person-centered, therapeutic, culturally informed way of communicating just blows me away. But then on the left and right side of him, you've got the aunts there and they're the ones that are like, you know, in that the authority, like they're growling them.
It's
you
tough,
know?
man.
And
it's not a get out of jail free card.
yeah, absolutely,
It's tough.
absolutely, it's not, and it really rebalances it rebalances authority culturally in terms of accountability in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But then it also balances back this level of role to the state in terms of understanding trauma and why people are where they are. Because for many of the fellas that we've come across, some of the stuff they've experienced that's brought them back into custody has been within, you know, for impacts of forced child removal as children and different factors from the system that have still got them in these spaces today. And so, it's exciting. It's really exciting times.
So for the last year, we've stood up the Wallumbilla Court, which is great. Been able to expand circle sentencing courts to a number of other places. New Corey Court in Dubbo, which is a kids' version of that.
Yep.
Hopefully going to get some changes in the Children's Care Court along the same lines. So that's really good in the justice system. And so it's quite exciting, but we need to take that approach to everyone.
Yeah.
You asked me what are some of the highlights, I suppose, in the last year or so. We were able to change the law in the child protection system last year. Possibly didn't go as far enough as some people would have liked, but it introduced some really important things. It introduced these 5 snake principles to how the child protection system has to be managed. And those principles really try and enshrine the voice of Aboriginal people in decision making.
Yeah, okay.
And the system's got a long way to go to properly affect that, but it's in the law now, so it has to be done. And it introduced a new concept called active efforts, which comes from the American Indian child welfare system.
Yeah, okay.
But it looks at lifting the standard of child protection casework and the standard of things that a court needs to properly look at before a child can come into out-of-home care. And the objective of that is to really make sure a removal is the absolute last resort, that everything else has been explored before that actually happens, because that doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's to try and put a whole bunch more structure around that decision-making and put our families and communities at the forefront of having a voice. There still needs to be a whole bunch of structural changes in that system to allow that to happen. But putting it in the law and having that legal framework is a really important first step, and we were able to do that last year.
Yeah, exciting.
And you mentioned the ministerial forum we had a month or so ago, and that was the new Minister for Community Services bringing a whole bunch of Aboriginal people together to talk about what's wrong with the system, what do we really need to do to move forward on that. And she's agreed to make some big changes initially, so to change all of our risk assessment processes, and that'll have some bigger changes in the system.
Yeah, great.
To really focus on restoration and have a task force that focuses on getting kids out. The system at the moment doesn't focus on that.
Yeah.
And she's agreed to set up a partnership group of Aboriginal people that will meet and drive that reform with her together.
Yeah,
so I'm hoping some big change will come in this system from that. And big structural change, not just little bits and pieces, but
absolutely
looking at how do we delegate decision making to communities for things that affect their own families.
Definitely.
And how do we take the involvement of the state in someone's life to the very minimum it ever needs to be. So it really is the last resort.
Absolutely. I think that that restoration task force or however that sort of shift looks is going to be a game changer, you know, for someone with lived experience, but then for also someone who worked as a social worker for a long time. Whenever working with families that have experienced, you know, removal of their children, it just always felt like such a fight to even bring restoration conversations to the forefront. So to start to shift that lens in terms of how we approach that, it's going to be a game changer. And
even that, so if you want to focus a child protection system on restoring children, it's a cultural change in an organisation, it's a policy shift, but it's more than that, it's a lot more than that.
Totally.
So we've got a legislative environment at the moment that doesn't encourage it. It makes it hard to do. If you've got a child in that system and you want to get the child out, you've got to file legal applications. You've got to prove to a court that its original decision needs to be overturned. The decisions that are made to remove children are often made that child comes into parental responsibility of the minister till they're 18. So we were just talking about the criminal justice system. If you take a 6-month-old baby that comes into care, You got to do something pretty bad in the justice system to get a 17.5-year sentence.
Yeah,
But in the out-of-home care, it's almost the default position, right?
definitely.
And the law shapes that. And so if we really want to reform a system to make it focused on restoration and keeping kids safe at home, it's not just a cultural thing in the department. It's looking at how the whole system shapes.
Yeah,
And it's looking at the rules of that system and shifting them. So you're shifting the presumptions. At the moment, the presumption the kid goes into care and stays there.
yeah,
You need to shift that presumption to say, well, that's not the presumption anymore.
absolutely.
And there are good systems around the world where the presumptions are different and the assumptions of that system are different. And that's where my role kind of comes in. It's not just about practice change with, the old DOPS caseworkers.
Yeah, totally.
It's about how do you shift those, the pillars of the system so that they're designed to push the whole system in the constructive way that we all want it to be, which is about family, not about individuals, about well-being, not about risk,
Yep.
and about on what do we really need to do to make children safe in their own home with their own mom.
Yeah, totally.
And there's always going to be instances where children are actually unsafe and there needs to be an intervention to make them safe.
Absolutely.
No one disputes that. There's not an Aboriginal person in the country that doesn't say keep a child in an unsafe place. Nobody
Absolutely.
says that. But it's how you do it and what happens after that is what matters. And doing that where people are properly respected. Even if a child is removed, the parents of that child deserve every respect that every other parent deserves in the way they get treated.
Yeah.
And the focus, I think, needs to be how do we get that child safely back to their mom as fast as we possibly can. And that doesn't happen in the way we want to at the moment, and there's a big reform that needs to happen to make sure that does.
Yeah. You talked about shifting to a well-being first sort of way of thinking and way of working. And you've identified clearly that it's not just practice changes that need to happen at a working level to see the impacts of this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
There's some really big pillars that need to shift to sort of get there. But for sort of people listening that are working in this space, that are leaders, maybe like yourself, or they're just other practice experts, what are some key messages that you think people need to be taken away in terms of how they can support and influence the change?
Look, have hope that the system's going to change. I've got hope at the moment that this system is on a journey of reform and change. I'm hoping that reform's going to be faster and longer and bigger. There are options for them to be involved at a community level in decision making. ABSEC's got funds from the government to set up these things called Aboriginal Community Control Mechanisms. Bad name, like really bad name. But the idea is in every area you'll have a local community mechanism where people can actually get involved in holding the system accountable.
Yeah, okay.
And making sure it does what it's supposed to do, but also be able to advocate for community members who are caught up in that system. I've had some dealings with the first one that's been set up, which is in Shell Harbour on the south coast.
Yeah.
Really powerful people involved in that.
Yeah, great.
Lots of lived experience in that group, as well as professional experience in that group of the child protection system, and a massive passion just to make it better for people and to keep families safe and together. But there's going to be great opportunity for people to be involved in that. If we can get similar reforms in the court system as we have in the criminal system, there'll be options for people to be involved in courts. And I'm hoping that the government is going to see a shift in the way we're investing our resource from investing very heavily in the out-of-home care to investing in prevention and services that keep families together.
Yeah.
So if people are involved in running those kinds of services, keep an eye out for some reform coming in next calendar year, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's some really critical stuff to take away, particularly for people listening that are either from community or working alongside community, particularly around the Aboriginal community control mechanisms or community care models of local governance that are, that really sort of came through as one of the key sorts of pieces of feedback from that workshop where we're at in terms of how do we bring community into this and elevate voices and power around things that are impacting families in our communities.
What we're seeing in other jurisdictions is, Victoria and Queensland in Australian jurisdictions are leading the way here, where the state is delegating its decision-making power to Aboriginal organisations. So if children do come into the care system, decision-making for them once they're in there is delegated to Aboriginal people, so that decision-making doesn't sit inside big departments like ours, ministerial officers,
Yeah.
but is being made by Aboriginal people who understand the family and the circumstances.
Yeah.
I'm really hoping that we'll get to that position pretty quickly in New South Wales, where we're starting to do that here,
Totally.
and exploring where the state can just take a step back and let our mob make decisions they need to make in
Absolutely.
the interest of their family.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's pivotal, hey, moving in that direction.
Yeah.
I think it's not an easy journey even for our communities to get there as well. I think navigating the complexity around agency and our involvement in those sorts of spaces is tough for us professionally, let alone personally as well at a community level.
Just going back to that original story about circle courts,
Yeah.
I met with that magistrate in Nowra to say, hey, bud, you want to do this?
Yeah.
Actually, we took him out to Mexican lunch, and he said, yeah.
Yeah.
But the next phase was, or part of that was talking to the community about the idea, and had a couple of big community meetings there, talking through the idea. People really liked the idea.
Yeah.
But got to the point of saying, okay, who wants to sit on a circle? Nobody.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like people came to the conclusion that this is a really good thing to do. But I'm not sure if I'm the person that wants to do it. And so that took it took the courage of a group of quite old Aboriginal women who put their hands up and said, we will do this.
Yeah.
And they really paved the way and showed you can do it. You can take on this responsibility. And it's a really good thing.
Yeah.
And now, hopefully, we're moving in the same direction with decisions in the child protection system. People, as you say, will rightly say, what's my role in this, and do I want to take on some of these decisions? And that's going to be a big step for some people initially, and a courageous step for people that want to do that. And there are people that do.
Yeah, definitely.
And we're going to have to learn how to do that well, and hopefully do that together.
Totally.
But I'm confident in the end we'll end up as we are with circle courts, where there's just no question about that, and people are quite confident in doing it. And we've got all the back office systems right to make sure that we can support them properly doing it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we had a bit of a yarn about how that sort of reform might look like at a community level in terms of participation and involvement structurally. What about from you talked about some of the major pillars, and that this is significant sort of structural work that we're playing in. How do you think about the role of whole of government involvement and ways of working in this sort of space?
It's really crucial. In out-of-home care, it's crucial, and the justice system is crucial. There's the way government agencies interact with one another, sometimes for a really good reason, can have really bad consequences. The classic example is the issue of domestic violence for Aboriginal women. So often you'll get a person in a violent circumstance that wants help to get out of it. But if it's a woman, her experience in dealing with the police, for example, might cause her not to want to call them because she's worried that they'll run a warrant check on her.
Absolutely.
For example, or want to come and check what she's doing, or have a look around her house if she calls them out there. Possibly because she's got experience of that happening before, or she's seen it happen to other people.
Totally.
And if she's got kids, she probably knows if she calls the police have to call docs, right? They have to call us.
Yep.
And I've heard, as many of us have, Aboriginal women say, I'll stay with the violence because I don't want to lose my children.
Yep. Absolutely.
And working in the out-of-home care system, that's a real concern. Like, she should be worried about that because it happens.
Totally.
None of that is designed to achieve that result of discouraging a woman in a violent situation, choosing not to get help and staying with the violence. Like, that link between the child protection system and the cops is designed to make kids safe.
Yeah.
But too often it's working in a way where it's actually making them less safe because it's causing people not to go there.
Totally.
And it comes back to that issue we talked about earlier. If you've got to put people at the centre of solving problems, not systems and not laws. And if you put that woman at the centre, you probably don't end up with that same system. You end up with something different.
Yeah.
You end up in a way that can make her safe, can make the kids safe, still deals with the violence properly, but doesn't have these perverse consequences of causing people to live in unsafe environments. And that's just stupid, but it does happen a lot.
Absolutely.
Part of my job is trying to unpick a lot of that. We've got some trials that we're working on at the moment in a couple of places where hopefully we're going to unpick all of that. But that also means to really do that, you've got to put community in control and make decisions around that. So that if that woman does want help, she doesn't have to go to the cops. Maybe if she wants to, she should go there and not have to worry about those consequences.
Totally.
But if she wants to go to someone in the community, she should also be able to do that.
Absolutely.
There's some great examples in New Zealand, for instance, where when police get called to a DV incident, they take a worker from a local marae with them.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not going on their own, they're going with community who understand that family.
Yeah.
And the idea is, the police will deal with the actual criminal element if they need to, but that worker from the marae is there just for the family.
Yeah.
For whatever they need. Whoever in that family needs whatever it is. And it's not about a DV service or a child protection response or this, it's just about the family. And doing what you need to do to help those people sort out those problems. And that's really where we need to get to. We're putting family and people at the centre of what we do and designing things around them.
Yeah.
It's a bit easier to say that than it is to do it because you're unpicking lots of other stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's the focus you have to have. And you need to bring everything back to people.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really great example of, I guess, a complex policy, and a complex and sensitive policy environment, but how we can, work across those sections, across those government sections together to try and impact the outcomes for people on the ground. But there's a range of other ways that sort of can look like as well. We think about, budget and funding opportunities, and policy development in different areas as well. I often think about some of the early intervention and community programs that we see across our communities. We know that there's some of the significant impacts of reducing contact with the justice system and other factors as well. Those projects that are funded, they're by nature of early intervention, are touching a range of different government agencies, whether it's education, health, environment, if they're doing stuff on country and culture. All these different sort of, I guess, government portfolios have a piece in the impacts that are happening in community. But often, if we think about it as early intervention, specific funding, then then the responsibility of that falls on DCJ. And I think about it because a few years ago I have this example of this amazing program that I was doing. I was on their board as a volunteer. Program been running for 10 years, achieves amazing outcomes in community. I know because I've got family that have been a part of it, I've seen it firsthand. Every year they have to reapply for their funding. Yeah. And I went in with the then CEO at the time and sat down, had a meeting and stuff, and really it was a small, I think the budget was like $100,000 or something to get for the outcomes and the young people that I was serving. Seemed pretty good value for the investment. And I sat with the program and I was speaking to the caseworkers there, and I was like, oh, so what's the day-to-day look like? And she's like, oh, well, I'm at the school a couple of days a week because some of the kids that we work with, they're at risk of, truancy and disengaging. So we're doing stuff in the school. So I was like, okay, so you're working in the education space technically in terms of engagement and all that sort of stuff. And then spoke to another worker and she's like, yeah, I'm working with the hospital because we've got a couple of our kids that got, some complex diagnosed needs. And so I work with the hospital around that sort of stuff. And so anyway, after a couple of days, I started to realize that this project that was solely funded really by DCJ because of the risk of, because of its primary focus around reducing engagement for young people in the justice system, actually it operated from a holistic model and it touched all these different points. And so I sort of said, years ago I worked on Bowraville on solution brokerage, and we had a whole of government response to how we did that work. And I saw how government can come together to collaborate, to see impact at a local level. And I remember sort of proposing at that point in time, I was like, if we sort of look at the different parts of the puzzle that these programs are working with, is there a way that we can have conversations across agencies where that $100,000 investment that you have no budget for becomes maybe a $10,000 investment across a handful of agencies? Or maybe DCJ doesn't invest anything financially, but because you have the subject matter expertise around the space we're playing in, maybe you lead the coordination of it, and we bring some of these other pieces of the puzzle along. I think it comes back to that holistic way of how we try and understand how we work with people and communities, right? Because so often we see so much of our, and for, like you said before, rightly so in a lot of cases, but different programs operating independent and in isolation of each other. But if we can start with people and community and then get government to come together, and sometimes we can actually see a real sustainable impact for
Yeah.
that stuff long term.
Completely agree. And it's about putting people at the centre of what you do. And I think, I'd like to see us move from kind of a program funding model to just a process of investment. So
Yeah.
if we were to say, here's community X, and community X wants to do work around making sure families are safe and strong, and the benefit of that is kids don't go into care, people don't experience violence, people don't touch the criminal justice system. I'd like to see a day where we just say, we're going to permanently invest in that here, and the investment is whatever it is, and we just work with the community to work out how their investments apply. And there's no applications, there's no program funding, there's no re-application every year. You're just saying, this is an investment we're going to continue to make. We can see the benefit, and we're going to work with you to work out how that's actually done.
Yeah.
And you might change that over time.
Absolutely.
There's no reason why you can't do that. From a government point of view, we've got probity requirements which get in the way. We've got statutory responsibilities that get in the way. And we've kind of got administrative structures around areas of government policy, and we tend to design everything around those. But to your point, it doesn't design it around people. So that family that's getting services for kids in care, whose kids might be touching the justice system, who got housing needs, got a whole bunch of health conditions, who are trying to keep their kids in school, for them it's one family, right?
Yeah.
From a government point of view, 7 different departments and 100 different programs. We should just do one thing.
Absolutely.
Just do one thing. And that's where it's got to come back to putting the family at the centre of what you do, and thinking differently about how you design funding models and administrative structures that can really just put the family at the centre.
Yeah.
It's easier to say it than it is to do it.
Totally. Absolutely. And I think we're based here in sort of Sydney and stuff like that, but I think about the impact of that ways of working in those smaller communities where even some of those issues are more heightened and can be more complex. Some of our regional communities, remote communities that are struggling with particularly around young people and stuff, with a whole range of stuff that's happening there, the real impact we can have if we start to identify and invest in that sort of way of thinking.
I was talking to an aunt last year in Mount Druitt, and she got a bunch of kids. Some of them have had troubles, and because of that, she's got a bunch of grandkids I think 3 or 4 grandkids that she was caring for.
Yeah.
One of those grandkids was formerly in out-of-home care and placed with her. So therefore she gets access to programs and funds. A couple of the others, one of her children, a discussion between her and her children said, can you just take care of these kids? So those children weren't in out-of-home care, but were in exactly the same circumstance as the one that was, right?
Yeah.
But for those 2, she gets nothing.
Yep.
And she was talking about, a couple of these kids had intellectual disabilities and some other challenges, and she would get programs for some of them, but for others, they were aged a year out of the program catchment.
Yeah.
And so she's sitting there and she's saying, I can see all the services I need. They're all here, but I can't get them.
Totally.
Like, they're out of my reach. I just can't get them. Because they've been designed by, frankly, public servants sitting in an office trying to meet a program requirement. They're not designed about what does this family actually need to get on the life. And what does this lady who's lived the full life, who's expected to kind of retire and relax a bit, who now has to deal with a whole bunch of kids in her house, what do we do to give her the help that she needs?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's how do you get all the rules and the bullshit out of the way so that you can actually help her do that? And that's the challenge to reform.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think that really brings back a really sort of not uncommon experience for many families that are dealing with the care and protection system. Sometimes the navigation for support, but then sometimes the access to resources that are available for some young people that are in care that are just as equally as needed, or even more so for some kids that aren't in that system as well, and really sort of heightens and reaffirms some of those factors around accessibility of those services for our families and communities more broadly, and why do we have to have why does it need to get to that point, or why do these resources have to be so inaccessible for the community more broadly, that you'd have to see such a sad example like living in out-of-home care to be able to get the access, the thorough and robust access to the services you need. one of the biggest things that stood out for me as well from the forum that we were at not long ago was the statistics around the number of young people that have been removed because of neglect.
Yeah.
And again, one of the aunts from the room made the comment that that like where our kids are being removed because of poverty and because of disadvantage. And I mean, I think that service sort of yarn we have there is another sort of poignant one too. But it's interesting because we often talk with friends and other people in community thinking like if our families got the funding that foster care has got to care for our kids, if we were able to get that tax free and work, we'd be able to provide a lot more resources for our children too, and address some of those issues around poverty and neglect that might have led to their removal as well. And I know that each situation is complex, but those stats from that evaluation really sort of stood out for me as well. Is there anything that sort of comes up for you when you think about some of that stuff around poverty and neglect?
Yeah, completely. Like poverty doesn't mean bad parenting, right? It just means poverty. It just means you don't have what somebody else might have.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of issues there. There's just the issue of poverty and access to things. But there's also people from one culture looking at what's going on for people's houses in another culture.
Yeah.
And so what might be normal for you or me, for someone who's never been in an Aboriginal household before, they don't understand it.
Yeah, totally.
It's foreign and they're seeing risk everywhere.
Totally.
And also, if you set up a system that's based on risk, you're going to find it everywhere. Like if you go out looking for risk, you're going to find it.
Yeah.
Like you bring someone into this environment and say, tell us all the risk, they'll find a million of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But if you have a system that's based around well-being and about what do we do to make this family well and functioning properly and happy and set up right, you might look at risks to say, how do we mitigate those and stop them from happening? But you're looking at a constructive way of how do we help people?
Yeah.
And that's really the reform that we're hoping to get to with this system, is to say, let's stop looking for risk everywhere. Let's look at the whole family and the whole people. Let's help people where we can.
Yeah.
And that statutory intervention, that is where the state comes in to say, we're going to exercise authority to remove a child, is rare.
Yep.
It's the absolute last resort. And if ever happens, it's temporary.
Yeah, I reflect on it a lot, like I've got a lived experience of my sister was living down the block in Redfern. She was 7 when she was removed. And at the time, my mother was dealing with really complex diagnosed mental health sort of stuff. And for whatever reason, she never came home. She was awarded the state. And often I reflect back to those times because that's why the neglect and poverty stuff stood out, because it was the majority of sort of the basis for those decisions being made. But I often think, if the resources were there to invest in either providing support for my mother at the time who was really, really unwell, or for my father who had experienced, really complex trauma and systemic sort of abuse, if that sort of stuff, if that wraparound sort of well-being approach had been taken, life might have looked very different for her. And so I think that's 20 years ago now. And the challenge, I think, for us sitting here today is that we still see a significant statistic of young people that are being removed for the same reasons.
Yeah. And the challenge for a place like DCJ is, how do you refocus all of your effort to making people better and well? We've done some work at the end of last year just saying how many families are in the different parts of DCJ at the same time. So living in public housing, someone in the justice system, someone in out-of-home care, people accessing DV services that we might fund. Initially, it was hard to work that out, to be honest. It was hard to see it. But through some good work, we were able to work that out. There's thousands, as you can imagine, thousands of families in that circumstance.
Absolutely.
We're standing up a major program of reform, which we're calling the Common Client Reform, starting in southwestern Sydney.
Okay.
And the idea of that is, how do you take the staffing power of DCJ, its investment, its financial investment, its statutory authority, and put family at the centre of how you use that. So that if someone's touching DCJ, instead of the department pulling that family apart, we're taking it as an opportunity to use everything that we've got to try and help that person and get them out of the disadvantage that they might be in.
Totally.
So really trying to reform the whole department around those people. So if you were to start again and say, here are these families that are in this level of intergenerational disadvantage, and you had all this money in statutory authority, how would you use it differently? And so we're really thinking differently about that. And right now about to start doing that in southwestern Sydney.
Unreal. We talked about some of the things that people can take away in terms of what change looks like and how they can be a part of it. Many of the people that listen to and follow the work of this podcast and stuff that we do, you know, they're senior leaders like yourself, they're practitioners on the ground. But we know that there's major sort of structural shifts and journey that we're on. If you were to talk to any other sort of senior leaders, people in decision-making positions within your own or across government in terms of what we sort of need, any sort of key messages that you think people could take away?
Yeah, I think the message is simple, and it's complicated in its execution, but the message is simple. I always say there's three things that we need to focus on. One is put the family at the centre of everything you do. That is not just individuals, but from an Aboriginal point of view, you're designing a service, a structure, a program, a funding. Think about family interaction in its broader sense, kinship. Secondly, put culture at the heart of everything you design. I think asking whether things are culturally appropriate is yesterday's business.
Yeah, absolutely.
We need to say, has this been designed by and for Aboriginal people? You know, I often say to our child protection guys, you know, I could come to you and say, I've got a great program for kids from West Africa and I'm going to implement it in RIDE. And you might say, well, that's good. It's a strange thing to do. Why would you take a program from West Africa and implement it in RIDE? So, but we do that to Aboriginal families and kids every day of the week.
Totally.
Take stuff from Western Europe or North America and say, this is going to fit. Yeah, it doesn't. So we need to put culture at the heart of everything we design. And that's decision making, it's structural design. The Aboriginal courts are the best example of how you can do that. And the third point is shared decision making with Aboriginal people. And that should be every layer. So I'd like to see a situation where no decision about an Aboriginal family is made without Aboriginal people making that decision. That there is no Aboriginal person in court that's not an Aboriginal court. But also, how do we share that all the way up? So the minister in establishing this partnership group looking at child protection reform, that group's going to meet around reform, but it's also going to meet around managing the system as it is. Looking at performance, budgets, resource allocation, those kinds of questions. Let's start to think at how we share authority in that way, so that we're looking at how we share the management of systems. Those examples I gave you earlier around child protection delegating statutory authority to ACCO, share that authority. Trust people to be able to hand that over. So three things: put family at the centre, put culture at the heart, and share decision making with Aboriginal people. You do those three things and think about how you reform your organisation and your policy and your service design around those three things. You can get some pretty significant reform, I think, and make some big differences for people.
That shared decision making point really sort of sticks out at me, because I think and I think I agree wholeheartedly with everything that you said. I think the third one sort of sticks out at me in terms of maybe the most hardest one for us to do in terms of the public sector, because of that fear or that risk aversiveness, or sometimes the public sector being so risk averse to getting it wrong that we stay idle.
Completely.
Keep doing what we've been doing. Anything to say to people listening?
Huge problem. Paralysis through fear. Questions about legislative authority and accountability. It's like, I'm accountable for these decisions, therefore I need to make them. But I go back to where we started, the Wallumbilla Court. So if you take the way that court works, that judge is sharing his authority with Aboriginal people, sharing decision making with Aboriginal people, opening his court up to Aboriginal families to come and sit around the table. And ultimately they're making a decision to sentence someone, which is a legal decision of a court. I don't know if you dealt with a lot of judges, but one of the things that judges hate is if they make a decision and that decision gets appealed to another court and the other court finds they made a mistake. That's like the biggest public slap down a judge could get. They hate it. But the important thing about the Wallumbilla Court, Judge Hunt, who's sitting on that court now, will make a sentencing decision that's a shared decision. If that decision gets appealed to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court finds that that decision was wrong, that's completely on him. That's not on those other blackfellas who are sitting around the table. That's completely on him. And he knows that. And so every one of those judges and magistrates that's presiding over an Aboriginal court has made a conscious decision. I'm going to share my authority with these people, and I'm going to completely take accountability personally for that decision every time it's made. And they're doing it, and they've been doing it for 20 years. And I go back to that original point. If a judge can do that, and that accountability is personal to him.
Absolutely.
It's not saying there was a decision that was an error in the district court. It's saying Judge Hunt made a mistake.
Yeah.
In public and recorded forever.
Absolutely.
Yeah, as you know, our court system's looking at those judicial decisions from 200 or 300 years ago and still applying them now.
Yeah, totally.
If they can do that, anybody else making a decision with statutory authority can do the same thing.
And so it takes a level of, I guess, courage,
and maturity, responsibility,
absolutely,
and a focus on the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Getting towards the end of our time together, conscious of time, I want to take a moment to thank you for giving up your time. It's a busy time of year. It's a heavy time of year for us. You know, people listening, we've got the referendum coming up this weekend. By the time this gets out, whatever happens on the 14th will have been said and done. But just want to acknowledge that, you know, you're coming here in a really busy time, personally and professionally, to give it up, to have a yarn about all this sort of stuff. Are there any sort of final thoughts or any sort of key messages you want to say that you feel like you might have haven't had a chance to?
Yeah, look, just thank you for the opportunity. Always really happy to come and have a yarn about these things. The more we talk about complicated problems and talk about what we can do about them, the more confident other people are, I think, in particularly non-Aboriginal people, in engaging on the journeys that we're on and on helping to solve the problems that we're trying to solve. I mean, I often go back to the people that have come before us, you know, people like William Cooper and William Ferguson, Pearl Gibbs, and the types of things we're talking about now are the things they were talking about in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think all of us always need to think about those people because we're here because of them.
Totally.
And there's a legacy that they've left us and an opportunity that we now have that we owe it to their spirit and their history to deliver on it.
Absolutely.
Completely.
Absolutely. I think that's a really critical way for us to finish in terms of knowing where we've come from and taking a bit of that with us in terms of where we're going. I think for anyone listening, whether you're a senior leader and a decision maker, there's something valuable that you can take from this yarn. Whether you're someone working on the ground in policy or in the day-to-day, there's some really valuable pieces of advice to inform how you work in this space and with our communities. And at a local level, if you're passionate about this sort of space, if you're passionate about reform, out-of-home care, the DCJ world, there's some really exciting sort of things on the reform agenda for community to have some agency and be a part of as well. So really valuable yarn, Ra, and just want to thank you again so much.
Yeah, happy to come along. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, deadly.